My aunt's laughter split the silence of the grand ballroom like a crack running through January ice. Sharp, contemptuous, deliberate. She tilted her chin upward, swept her eyes across a room full of officers in dress uniform, then turned to lay a proprietary hand on my cousin's shoulder. "Her?" she said, loud enough for the nearest 3 tables to hear. "In the RCMP, Spencer's the one with real backbone. He's the one who should be standing in a room like this." My cousin straightened his jacket, that same smug tilt to his jaw I remembered from every Christmas dinner I'd sat through as a child. He took 2 steps toward me. His hand came up without hesitation. The open palm strike connected with my cheek in a crack that silenced the string quartet mid-phrase. "You don't belong here," he said. My cheek burned. The heat spread under my skin like spilled coffee soaking through cloth. But I didn't touch my face. I didn't step back. I didn't blink. I just planted my feet on that polished parquet floor and looked at him with the kind of stillness you learn after 22 years of walking into rooms where no one expected you to last. My aunt was already smiling, certain she had just reduced me to nothing in front of the right audience. That smile did not survive what happened next. 300 chairs pushed back from their tables in a single unified sound, a low, rolling thunder of wood and metal that shook the crystal pendants in the chandeliers overhead. 300 RCMP officers, veterans, and federal law enforcement personnel rose to their feet as one, their red serge dress uniforms a wall of crimson that filled the room from aisle to aisle. A staff sergeant, beside the nearest column, stepped forward and positioned himself between my cousin and the rest of the room. His radio was already at his mouth. "Security to the front. We have an individual who just struck a superintendent." My aunt's champagne flute stopped halfway to her lips. But before I tell you what brought us to that moment in that ballroom, and the exact price my family paid for it, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, because what happened next was something nobody in that room could have predicted. I need to take you back 22 years. Back to a 2-story house on a quiet crescent in Kanata, on the western edge of Ottawa, where November always smelled like wood smoke from the neighbor's fireplace and the warm, earthy sweetness of my Gran's baking. Gran raised me after my parents' accident on the 4th or 17 when I was 7. She was my father's mother, a retired schoolteacher with thick silver hair she wore in a low bun, and hands stained faint green from her garden. She drove me to every swim meet, sat in the back row of every school play, and left a light on in the kitchen window whenever I came home late so I would never pull into a dark driveway. She never once made me feel like anything other than exactly where I was supposed to be. My aunt, my father's sister, lived 40 minutes away in Barhaven, and she had opinions about everything. How Gran spent money, how Gran spent her time, how Gran was too lenient with me. She had 2 children of her own. My cousin Spencer, whom she discussed the way people discuss royalty, and my cousin Hadley, who had learned early that the safest way to exist in that family was to agree with everything her mother said. I announced my intention to apply to the RCMP at Gran's kitchen table on a Thursday evening in late August. I was 19 years old. My aunt happened to be there. She had come by to discuss Gran's RRSP, a conversation Gran told me later she hadn't actually initiated, but hadn't known how to end. My aunt set down her tea and looked at me the way you look at something mildly offensive you found on the bottom of your shoe. "The RCMP," she said. Not a question, a verdict. She gestured toward my Gran, the deliberate, weaponized gesture of a woman who had spent a lifetime using other people's fragility as ammunition. "Look what your grandfather's service got this family. Decades in uniform and what was left at the end. A pension that barely covered his care home. Spencer is articling downtown. That's what real ambition looks like." Gran's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth. My aunt was already smoothing the front of her blazer, already pivoting toward the door. "If you want to throw your best years at a northern posting and call it a career, that's your choice," she said. "But don't expect this family to stand and applaud it." She left before Gran could answer. Gran reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her palm was warm and dry and smelled like the dish soap she always used. She squeezed once hard. "You go," she said quietly. "You go and don't look back at her." I left for Depot Division 3 weeks later. The RCMP Training Academy sits on a red brick campus in Regina, Saskatchewan, where the prairie sky is wider than anything I had grown up knowing, and the wind comes at you from every direction simultaneously. 6 months of physical conditioning, law, defensive tactics, and firearm qualifications. We ran formations in -20 wind chill. We were underwater, sleep-deprived, and evaluated constantly. The male recruits from rural Alberta had sized me up within the first week. I was 5'4" and 130 pounds, and I watched one of them tell another, loud enough to carry over the sound of boots on frozen asphalt, that I'd be done before Christmas. I heard him. I filed it away the way you file evidence you intend to use later. Every morning in that Regina cold, when my lungs felt like I was breathing broken glass and my shoulders shook under the training pack, I heard my aunt's voice in my skull. That flat, dismissive tone. Spencer is the one with real backbone. I used it the way you use a fire, deliberately, carefully, to keep moving when your body is arguing for surrender. I did not ring out. Before I shipped to my first posting, I drove back to Ottawa for 4 days. I sat with Gran in her kitchen and held her hands across the same table where my aunt had delivered her verdict, and I told her I was going to be okay. She cried a little. I didn't. Then I walked into a financial services office on Merivale Road and set up an automatic monthly transfer, a portion of my constable's pay, more than I could comfortably spare, into a separate account linked to a private home care agency I had researched the week before. Gran didn't need full-time support yet, but I knew my aunt. I had watched her redirect conversations about Gran's savings, suggest that certain expenses were unnecessary, position herself as the practical one in every financial decision. I had no faith in the choices she would make if Gran's health ever shifted. So I built an invisible net. Gran would never know where the supplemental payments came from, the agency would never say. But the net would be there. My postings took me through 3 provinces in 8 years. Northern Ontario detachments where backup was 40 minutes by road on a good night. A major crime secondment in Edmonton. An undercover unit out of Vancouver that taught me the most dangerous situations are almost always the quietest ones. The skepticism about my gender followed me like a second shadow until a specific moment in each posting made it stop. In Edmonton, during a domestic call that escalated faster than any of us anticipated, I talked a man down from a second-floor window ledge for 90 minutes while my partner held the perimeter below. Afterward, my sergeant looked at me for a long moment and nodded. The particular nod of someone recalculating an assessment they'd held without examining it. That nod was enough. What didn't get easier were the promotion ceremonies. I stood at the podium in Ottawa for my inspector's ceremony and looked at the 3 name placards on the reserved family chairs in the front row. 3 placards, 3 empty chairs. The RCMP chaplain, a retired corporal with a permanent slight stoop and hands like cracked leather from decades of outdoor service, sat beside me at the reception afterward. He didn't offer hollow words about family or time. He handed me a coffee, black with 2 sugars, exactly right, and said, "The people who couldn't find their way here tonight are not the measure of what you've built." He stood up and left me with the coffee. I held that cup for a long time. Years later, at a service station off the Trans-Canada near Rivière-du-Loup, I was walking across the parking lot in civilian clothes when a man in a gray suit went down hard on the asphalt 30 feet ahead of me, his briefcase cracked open, papers scattered across the pavement in the wind. The people around him stood with their phones out, frozen. I dropped my bag and ran. I dropped to my knees on the cold asphalt and initiated compressions, both hands locked, counting out loud, forcing his heart to keep a rhythm it had abandoned. His ribs resisted and then gave slightly, the necessary violence of keeping someone alive. I kept the rhythm until paramedics screamed into the lot with lights running and took over. I left before he regained consciousness. I didn't know his name. I didn't know until much later that a small brass commemorative pin from my specialized unit had fallen from my jacket pocket and landed in his open hand while he was unconscious on the pavement. The years accumulated the way years do in a career like this, not in a line but in layers. Cases that couldn't be discussed. Funerals attended in dress uniform, flags received, hands shaken over losses that had no clean resolution. Gran called every month, always before 8 in the evening, and I pressed my phone against my ear wherever I was, and listened to her tell me what was coming up in her garden, what the deer had gotten into, whether the Senators had any hope this season. Once, very quietly, she told me she had asked my aunt to pass along my number to a mutual cousin who had wanted to reach me, and my aunt had said she didn't have it. Gran paused. Then she said she's always had it. I wired the next home care payment that same night and said nothing. When the invitation arrived on my desk, an ivory envelope with a gold foil seal, the annual guest list for the National Emergency Services Honors Gala at the Château Laurier, I almost set it in the administrative pile without opening it. Then I saw the embossed return address and slid it open. The attendee list was printed on cardstock. I ran my thumb down the columns until it stopped. Spencer Hartwell, Regional Sales Representative, Sentinel Safety Systems. My cousin, there as a vendor sponsor, there to press palms and collect cards from the senior RCMP brass and government officials who represented exactly the institutional clients his company needed. And beside his name, listed as an approved guest, my aunt. I set the envelope face down on my desk. I sat with my hands flat on the surface and felt a very particular kind of clarity settling into place. The quiet, functional calm that arrives when a situation you have been waiting for without fully naming it finally arrives. My aunt had spent 22 years constructing a version of reality in which I had made the wrong choice, proven her point, and faded appropriately into the background while the family's golden children stood where the light was. The Château Laurier's grand ballroom, full of the exact audience she valued most, was about to become the last place that version of reality would ever be performed. The morning of the gala, I stood before my mirror and buttoned my red serge dress uniform slowly, one button at a time. The wool is heavier than people expect. 2 dense layers of red, the gold lanyard across the chest, the campaign ribbons above the left breast pocket, each one a chapter of work that existed entirely outside my family's understanding of who I was. I fixed the superintendent's insignia onto my epaulets with the same steady hands I used for everything requiring precision. I squared my cap, I took a breath, I walked out. I entered the ballroom the way I entered any controlled environment, measured, aware of every quadrant, collecting information before committing to movement. The string quartet paused naturally between pieces as I came through the main doors. Officers throughout the room clocked the superintendent's crown on my epaulets and adjusted their posture. I had learned not to break stride. My aunt was at a sponsor's table near the front, draped in a wine-colored blazer that was doing its best to look formal, a flute of sparkling water in one hand, talking toward a woman beside her who had the expression of someone enduring rather than enjoying the conversation. Spencer sat to her left, his company's branded folder on the table, his suit cut to project success rather than earn it. Hadley occupied the next chair over, her smile calibrated to a setting I recognized as self-protective neutrality. At the far end of the table, in a wheelchair that was new since I'd last seen him, sat my great-uncle Clive, my grand's older brother who had served 30 years in federal law enforcement and who, I understood in one cold second, my aunt had brought as a calling card. His dress blazer hung slightly loose on his frame. His eyes, when they found me across the room, went very wide and very bright and suddenly looked the age he had been the last time I'd seen him, the age when things were still possible. Then my aunt saw me. The water flute stopped moving. Her eyes did the calculation, uniform, rank, context, and then the smile came. The specific offensive smile of a woman who has decided that attack is better than retreat. She stood, stepped directly into the center aisle between the tables with the deliberateness of someone who has been blocking paths their entire life, and spoke loudly enough for the surrounding tables to register every word. Her, in the RCMP? A short, sharp laugh. She reached back and touched Spencer's arm. My son is the one with real spine. He's built something. She just never grew up. Spencer rose. He had his mother's instinct for escalation and none of her caution. He stepped toward me, and his hand came up, and the crack of the strike against my cheek brought the string quartet to an immediate halt. You were never welcome here, he said. My cheek burned, my pulse did not change. I looked at him with the flat, diagnostic calm of someone who has stood in front of actually dangerous people and knows the difference. And then the room detonated behind me. 300 chairs pushed back as one. The sound was low and wide and unstoppable, like a wave pulling gravel off a lakeshore. 300 officers in red serge stood shoulder to shoulder, spines straight, eyes burning, and fixed on the man who had just struck their senior officer in front of the full assembly. A staff sergeant stepped into the aisle without being instructed. 2 security personnel moved from the far end of the room towards Spencer in measured, purposeful strides. My aunt's water flute slipped from her fingers and shattered on the parquet. A figure rose from the head table before the silence could fully land. He moved slowly, a man in his mid-70s with the kind of bearing that never fully leaves a person who has commanded at scale. Retired Commissioner Strand had 3 wars' worth of ribbons on his chest, and the economy of motion of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to any room. He walked to the center of the hall, stopped 6 feet from my aunt, and reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He produced a small brass pin, the commemorative insignia of a specialized federal unit, scratched and worn from being kept in a box rather than on display. He held it between his thumb and forefinger under the chandeliers. 11 years ago, he said, his voice carrying to every corner without effort, I had a cardiac event in a parking lot off the Trans-Canada near Rivière-du-Loup. Every person around me froze. One person did not. He pressed his other hand briefly to his sternum, the unconscious reflex of a man whose ribs had been cracked during resuscitation and had never quite let him forget it. She saved my life and was gone before the ambulance departed. The only thing she left behind was this. He raised the pin higher. Every officer in the room recognized the insignia. A low sound moved through them, not loud, but felt in the chest. Commissioner Strand turned and looked at my aunt from a distance of 6 feet. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I spent 4 years trying to find her. There are 11 people in this country who have ever carried this pin. One of them is standing in this room tonight. He did not gesture toward me. The direction of his gaze was enough. The woman you just called a disappointment is the reason I was alive to walk my daughter down the aisle last spring. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the room came apart at the seams. Voices rose from every direction: active officers, veterans, retired personnel, federal officials. A woman near the left aisle called out that I had pulled her partner out of a burning vehicle on the Coquihalla Highway. A retired staff sergeant at the back of the hall stood and said half his unit owed their lateral transfers to my early training. The testimonies didn't pause, didn't stack neatly, just kept coming. A full wall of witness that my aunt had no architecture to absorb. There was no spin, no redirect, no sympathetic audience left to perform for. Her hand found the tablecloth. Her knuckles went white as her legs unsteadied beneath her. The tablecloth pulled. A water glass rolled off the edge of the table and broke on the floor. Hadley was already moving toward the side exit, her heels silent on the carpet, her eyes directed somewhere safely elsewhere. Spencer's arms were being guided behind his back by the 2 security officers. His company folder was still on the table. I had not said a single word to my aunt, not one. My silence was the only command I needed to give, and 300 people had answered it for me. Commissioner Strand crossed to where I was standing. He took my hand in both of his and turned it palm up and pressed the worn brass pin into my palm. He held my fingers closed around it for a moment. "You earned a proper return of this a long time ago," he said quietly. I didn't demand an apology from my aunt. I didn't require her to face me. I didn't deliver a speech or a closing argument or even a look that lasted longer than a second. The room had already spoken in a language she would spend the rest of her life trying to unhear. There was nothing I could add that would land harder than the silence I had already kept. I stepped around her the way you step around wreckage on a road that's been cleared. I walked to the far end of the sponsors' table where my great-uncle Clive sat with both hands gripping the wheelchair's armrests, his face completely undone. He was crying the way very old men cry, without sound, with enormous dignity, with decades of weight compressed behind it. I crouched down in front of him until we were eye level. My ribbons made a small sound against my tunic as I bent. I took both his hands in mine. His skin was paper-thin and cool, the veins raised like river lines on a map of every year I had been absent and every year he had waited. "I'm taking you home with me," I said, "tonight." He couldn't speak. He nodded once, and his whole body seemed to release something it had been holding for a very long time. I stood and drew his arm gently over my shoulder, feeling how light he had become, and helped him rise. He leaned into me, his great niece, the family's wrong choice, the one who had been discarded and dismissed and made to feel like a problem to be managed, and we turned together toward the door. The room had not sat down. 300 officers in dress uniform stood in 2 lines stretching from the sponsors' tables to the main doors, a corridor of red and gold and absolute, formal silence. Their backs were straight, their eyes were forward, their stillness was not absence. It was the most deliberate and complete form of respect the institution knows how to give. I walked my great-uncle through that corridor at the pace his legs required. Somewhere behind us, the string quartet began to play. The applause built from the back of the room forward until it filled the gilded ceiling of the Château Laurier and vibrated through the floor and into my chest, loosening something I had kept locked down for 22 years. I stopped at the threshold, let the sound reach us both. My great-uncle's thin hand tightened on my shoulder. I did not look back. The best thing I ever built wasn't a rank or a record. It was the decision, at 19 years old, sitting at Grand's kitchen table while my aunt walked out the door, not to let someone else's contempt become the ceiling of my life. Everything that came after was just the proof of that one refusal. I walked my great-uncle out into the Ottawa night, and I left my aunt standing in the wreckage of the only performance she had ever truly believed in. If you believe that the greatest answer to people who tried to write you off is a life they cannot argue with, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, who in your life tried to make you feel like you didn't belong, and how did you prove them wrong?